The day my husband slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table, he looked more relieved than I'd ever seen him look in 9 years of marriage. "I think we both know this is the right thing," he said, already reaching for his coffee like we were discussing a lease renewal. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at him. Then I looked past him, through the window, at his father's old truck sitting in our driveway, the truck his father had driven for 20 years before the stroke took most of his left side. "I want one thing," I said. My husband laughed a little. "What's that?" "I want to take your father with me." The laugh stopped. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning, honestly, starts not with my husband, but with the first time I met his father. His name was Frank, 68 years old, retired electrician, widower for 11 years, and the kind of man who still held doors open for strangers without thinking about it. When my husband, I'll call him Drew, because that's the name he's always gone by, not the one on his birth certificate. When Drew brought me home for Christmas his sophomore year of college, his father shook my hand at the door and said, "You must be the one he keeps forgetting to mention." And then he winked at me, and I knew immediately that I loved this man. Drew was different back then. Or maybe I only saw what I wanted to see. He was funny and driven and told me I was the smartest person he'd ever met, which I believed because I was 22 and stupid in the way that 22-year-olds are stupid about people who tell them exactly what they want to hear. We got married 3 years later in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Charlottesville, Virginia. His father cried. My mother cried. Drew gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made me cry, and I thought, this is it. This is the real thing. For a few years, it was. We moved to Charlotte for Drew's job at a commercial real estate firm. I worked as a paralegal and started taking evening classes toward my law degree. We bought a house, a real house, not a condo, with a backyard and a neighborhood where people walked dogs in the evenings and waved at each other. It felt like the life I'd been working toward since I was a kid, growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Roanoke with my mom, stretching every dollar she made as a medical receptionist. Frank visited twice a year, Thanksgiving and always a long weekend in June, because he liked the summer heat and said it was good for his joints. He and I would sit on the back porch after dinner while Drew watched whatever game was on, and Frank would tell me stories about Drew as a kid. The time he tried to fix the garbage disposal and flooded the kitchen. The summer he convinced his father to drive 11 hours to see a baseball game and it got rained out after 3 innings. Frank laughed at every story. Drew had grown up without a mother, and it showed in the way he and his father had built something between them that wasn't just father-son. It was more like 2 people who had been each other's only witness for a long time. I thought I understood what that meant. Later, I realized I hadn't understood it at all. The first sign I ignored was the business trips that started running long. 1 extra day became 2. Became a long weekend. Became a pattern I explained away with excuses Drew didn't even have to invent. I invented them myself, because it was easier than looking directly at the thing I was starting to suspect. The second sign was a change in how he touched his phone, a kind of alertness, a slight turning of the screen, small things. The kind of things you file away and tell yourself mean nothing. The third sign was the credit card statement I wasn't supposed to see because it went to his office email, and he'd accidentally forwarded it to our shared household account. 2 nights at a hotel in Raleigh during a week when I thought he was in Atlanta, a restaurant I didn't recognize. Flowers, not from any florist we'd ever used together. I didn't say anything right away. I know people find that hard to understand. Why wouldn't you just confront it immediately? But I think when you've spent 9 years building a life with someone, the discovery that it might be false doesn't make you want to blow it up. It makes you want to be absolutely certain before you do. So I waited. I kept my face neutral at dinner. I went to class on Tuesday nights and came home and kissed him and lay awake next to him in the dark. And I thought about what it would mean to be wrong and what it would mean to be wrong and which one I was more afraid of. I was right. Her name was Jessie. She worked in his firm's Durham office. She was 31, which was 2 years older than me, and she had the kind of Instagram that made it look like her whole life was a long golden afternoon. Winery trips, farmers markets, a golden retriever named something like Scout or Ranger. I'm not going to pretend I didn't look. I looked at everything. I sat in the parking lot of a Panera at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and I scrolled through every photograph she'd posted in the past 2 years, and I looked for my husband's hands, his jacket, the background of any place I recognized, and I found three. 3 photographs where if you looked at the edge of the frame, you could see a man's arm, a watch I'd given Drew for our 5th anniversary, a corner of the blue chambray shirt I'd bought him at a Nordstrom Rack in 2021. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about Frank. Frank had called me the week before. He called every Sunday, always around 7, always asked about my classes first before he asked about his son. That Sunday, he'd sounded tired in a way I didn't like. A flatness in his voice that I recognized because I'd heard it once before, right after his second TIA, which the doctors kept calling minor, in a way that made it sound like something you could simply move past. He'd told me not to worry. He'd told me he was fine. I'd made a note to call his neighbor, Diane, who kept an eye on him, and then I'd gotten distracted and forgotten. I called Diane at 7 in the morning the next day. She told me Frank had fallen twice in the past month, that he'd started having trouble with some words, that she'd driven him to a follow-up appointment the week before because he'd asked her not to bother his son, that Drew had just started a big project and Frank didn't want to be a disruption. That sentence, he didn't want to be a disruption. I sat with that for a long time. Drew and I had talked about his father's health before. Not seriously, not with any real plan, but in the vague way couples sometimes talk about aging parents. The way you acknowledge that eventually something will have to change without deciding what. Drew's answer was always some version of, "We'll figure it out when the time comes." The time, I now understood, had been coming for a while, and Drew had not been figuring anything out. He had been in Raleigh. He had been buying flowers. I hired an attorney. I told no one except my best friend, Tanya, who drove over with wine and sat with me on the floor of my home office while I explained what I'd found. She was the one who said, "Whatever you decide to do, make sure you're protected." Tanya works in HR and has the kind of practical intelligence I've always envied, the ability to separate what she feels from what needs to happen next. I cried. She held my hand. Then she went home and I started making a list. I want to be honest about this part, because I think people assume that in these situations there's a clean break. One day you're the wife, the next day you're someone who has left. It's not like that. It's weeks of living inside the same walls as someone you're secretly preparing to leave. It's sleeping on your side of the bed and making coffee in the morning and saying, "Have a good day" at the door, while some other part of you is quietly, methodically gathering yourself. It's the strangest loneliness I've ever felt, and I felt a lot of different kinds. I wasn't to see Frank. I didn't tell Drew. I told him I was visiting a law school friend in Roanoke, which was plausible because I do have a law school friend in Roanoke. I drove 3 hours north to the small town in the Shenandoah Valley where Frank had lived for 30 years, in the same house he and Drew's mother had bought when Drew was 4 years old. Frank opened the door, and his face did what it always did when he saw me, this soft, immediate brightening, like a lamp turning on, and I had to look at the porch floorboards for a moment before I could look back at him. He was thinner. The left side of his mouth had a slight droop I hadn't noticed on the phone. He moved carefully, with a deliberateness that told me he was compensating for something he didn't want to name. We sat on the porch. He made lemonade from a can, apologizing because he was out of real lemons. I told him about my classes. He asked what kind of law I wanted to practice. I said family law, which was only recently true, and he said he thought I'd be good at it because I paid attention to people. We talked for 2 hours. I helped him with the trash bags, which were heavier than he could manage easily without his balance going. I fixed the latch on the screen door that had been sticking. When I got back in my car to drive home, I sat in his driveway for a full minute before I could start the engine. I had already decided. I filed 2 weeks later. Drew came home to find my attorney's assistant waiting with the papers. I was not there. I was at Tanya's, which felt both cowardly and correct. He called me 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. The messages went from confused, controlled to something tight and careful, the voice he used when he was angry but trying to manage it. The last message said, "We should talk before you do something you can't undo." I texted back, "I'd like to meet with both our attorneys present." What followed was 6 weeks of negotiation that I will not describe in full because it was mostly paperwork and waiting and a specific exhaustion of having to be professional about your own heartbreak. What I will tell you is what happened when we finally sat across from each other at the conference table in my attorney's office, with both of our attorneys present and a mediator who had kind eyes and a very expensive blazer. Drew had prepared. He had a list of assets to divide. He was willing to let me stay in the house through the end of the year before it went on the market. He had run the numbers, clearly, and was prepared to be fair in the transactional sense, the way you can be fair about something when you no longer feel anything about it. I looked at the list. I said, "I don't want the house." He blinked. "Okay." "I don't want the investment accounts." His attorney looked up. "I don't want the car. I don't want spousal support." I had my own income. I had my own plan. I had been working toward independence for long enough that I was not going to let him write me a check and feel clean about it. "I want one thing." Drew looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on him. Not the relief he'd shown when I filed, not the careful blankness of the past 6 weeks, something more uncertain. "What?" he said. "I want to take your father." The silence in that room was different from other silences. The mediator set down her pen. My attorney, who had known what I was going to say, still held very still. Drew's attorney looked at Drew. Drew looked at me like I had said something in a language he almost but didn't quite speak. "You mean?" "I mean, I want to move him down to Charlotte with me. I'll take full responsibility for his care. I'll handle the medical, the finances, whatever he needs. I'm asking for him to be factored into the settlement as a dependent in my custody, essentially. Not legally. He's an adult, but formally recognized, so you can't come back later and claim any stake." Drew stared at me. "That's what you want," he said. "Instead of everything else?" "Yes." He laughed once, a short sound, not cruel, just stunned. Then he sat back, and what crossed his face in the next 10 seconds was something I will remember for the rest of my life because it moved through at least 4 different emotions before settling on something that looked unmistakably like relief. "Okay," he said. His attorney started to object, something about how this was irregular, how he'd want to document it carefully. Drew waved a hand. "Draft whatever you need to draft. She can have him." "She can have him." I went home to Tanya's that night and cried for 2 hours. Not because I was sad, but because I was so angry at what those words revealed, that a person who had driven 11 hours to see a rained-out baseball game with his son was being talked about like a line item, like a piece of furniture that was too much trouble to move. Frank didn't know any of this yet. I drove up to see him on a Saturday in September, the air already going crisp in the valley the way it does before anywhere else. I sat across from him at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't need, and I told him everything. The hotel receipts, the flowers, the filing. I told him I was sorry I hadn't told him sooner, and that I understood if he needed time, and that whatever he decided about his relationship with Drew was entirely his own. Frank listened the way Frank always listened. Fully, without interrupting, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know." I looked at him. "I didn't know the specifics," he said, "but I knew something. A father knows." He looked at his coffee cup. "I'm sorry he did this to you." "You don't have to apologize for him." "I know I don't have to." He looked back at me. "I want to." I told him about the settlement, about my request. I told him he was under absolutely no obligation, that I had a studio apartment lined up in Charlotte and a plan for my own life that didn't require anything from him. I just wanted to offer, I said. I wanted him to know he had options. Frank was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I started to worry I'd overstepped, that this had been presumptuous, that I'd built something in my head that wasn't actually... "When do we leave?" he said. We left on a Wednesday in October, with Frank's furniture in a rented trailer and his toolbox wrapped in moving blankets in the back of my car. He brought 3 boxes of books and a framed photograph of Drew's mother from their wedding day, which he set on the dresser in the guest room before he'd even unpacked anything else. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood near South Park, close to a neurologist's office that had been recommended to me by a colleague at the law firm where I was doing my paralegal work. Frank had his first appointment within the week. The neurologist, a patient, methodical woman named Dr. Hale, one of the few names I'll use because she matters to the story, reviewed his records and said the situation was more manageable than it looked, that with the right medication adjustments and some regular occupational therapy, she expected meaningful improvement. Not a reversal, but real, measurable progress. Frank went to therapy every Tuesday. He made friends with the man in the apartment next to ours, a retired contractor named, I'll call him Ray, who had a woodworking shop in his storage unit and started inviting Frank over on Thursday afternoons. Frank started sleeping better. He started eating better. The droop at the left side of his mouth gradually, over months, smoothed itself almost completely out. I passed the bar in February. I will never forget sitting in my car in the parking garage after checking my results on my phone, calling Frank first before I called anyone else, and hearing him say, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it," 3 times in a row, louder each time. Drew and I had been legally divorced for 4 months. He called me twice in that period, once to ask about some paperwork, once, and I genuinely think he didn't plan this, to ask how his father was doing. I told him Frank was doing well. Drew said he was glad. There was a pause, and then he said, "Jesse and I aren't, it's not what I thought it was." I said I was sorry to hear that, and I meant it in the specific, limited way you can mean something without it mattering to you personally anymore. He said he'd been thinking about calling his dad. I said he should. He didn't for another 3 months. When he finally did, Frank answered the call in the kitchen while I was in the living room reading, and I could hear one side of the conversation, not the words, just the shape of it, the long pauses and the short answers, and then, at the end, a longer stretch where Frank's voice went low and serious. After he hung up, he came and sat in the armchair across from me and looked at the ceiling for a while. "He wants to visit," Frank said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." He looked at me. "Is that okay? To think about it?" "Frank, this is your son. You don't need my permission." "I know." He folded his hands. "I just wanted to make sure it wouldn't be hard for you." I thought about that. I thought about the conference table, the mediator, the wave of Drew's hand. She can have him. It won't be hard for me, I said. I promise. There is something I need to explain about why I asked for Frank, because I can tell from the outside it probably looks like a strategy, and I'd be lying if I said it was completely naive. I understood, on some level, that Frank had a will, that he had a small but real estate in the valley, that he was not without assets. But I want to be honest, that was not the reason. The reason was simpler and harder to explain, which is that Frank was the only person in Drew's family who had ever treated me like I was worth something on my own terms. Not as Drew's wife. Not as a future daughter-in-law. Not as a variable in someone else's equation. Just as a person he was glad to know. You don't walk away from that. I couldn't. Even when walking toward it meant walking away from everything else. What happened next, I didn't see coming, which is maybe the point. If I had planned for it, it wouldn't have felt like grace. 11 months after I moved Frank to Charlotte, he called me into the living room on a Sunday evening and asked me to sit down. He had a folder on the coffee table. He'd been to see an estate attorney the previous week, he told me, at Dr. Turney, Hale's office building, which had a whole floor of professional services. He'd done this without telling me, which I only pretended to be annoyed about. The folder held a summary of his assets. The house in the valley, which was paid off. A brokerage account that Drew had never known the balance of. Savings. A small rental property in Front Royal that Frank had purchased in 1998 and that had been generating income quietly for 25 years. I stared at the folder. Then I stared at Frank. "Why are you showing me this?" I said. "Because I'm rewriting my will," he said, "and I wanted you to know before it was done, not after." I started to say something about how he didn't have to do this, that this wasn't why I know why you did it, he said quietly. You think I don't know? You think I haven't thought about it every single day this past year? He leaned forward. You left your marriage with your dignity and a suitcase and an old man who needed a neurologist? You didn't do that for my money. You did it because you're the kind of person who does that. He paused. And that is exactly the kind of person I want to leave things to. I cried. I'm not going to apologize for that. He patted my hand, the way he always did, twice. Then he said, Also, I need you to look at this paragraph because I don't understand what the attorney is trying to say here and it doesn't sound right. I laughed. I looked at the paragraph. I explained what it meant. He said, Well, why didn't they just say that? And I said, because attorneys are like that. And he said, you're going to be an excellent attorney. And I said, I know. And he said, good. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And we sat there in that living room in Charlotte, in the apartment that had become something I hadn't had in a long time, which was home. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Drew reached out again in the spring. He'd left the firm in Durham. He was doing consulting work, he said, which I suspected meant the transition had not been entirely voluntary. He asked if he could visit his father, and this time Frank said yes. I was not there for the visit. I gave them the apartment and spent Saturday afternoon at Tanya's, which seemed right. When I came home that evening, Frank was watching a game and didn't offer details, and I didn't ask. What I know is that over the following year, Drew called his father most Sundays. What I know is that Frank's health continued to improve, slowly and not without setbacks, but consistently in the right direction. What I know is that I passed the bar and then passed a second interview at a family law firm and started working the kind of cases where I could sit across from someone in the worst moment of their life and actually understand what they were going through. What I know is that I did not regret the choice I made at that conference table. Not once. Not on the days that were hard. Not on the days that were easy. Not at 3 a.m. when I lay awake and took inventory of my life. I treated 9 years of a marriage that had been slowly becoming something I didn't recognize for one relationship that had always been exactly what it appeared to be. Honest, steady, and full of bad puns and lemonade made from a can. I was cleaning out Frank's truck last fall. The old one he'd finally agreed to let me list for sale now that he wasn't driving anymore. Under the passenger seat, behind a manual he'd kept from 1987, I found a birthday card I'd sent him years ago, before any of this. I didn't even remember writing it. On the inside, I'd written, "Frank, thank you for raising someone worth loving, even if I ended up with the wrong one." He'd kept it under the seat of his truck for years. Some things you can't plan for, some things you can only recognize when they're in front of you as worth holding on to. Even when everyone at the table thinks you've lost your mind, even when the man across from you laughs and waves his hand like you're asking for the old lawn furniture. You know what you know. You hold on to what's real. And sometimes what's real is a man who still holds doors open for strangers and cries at weddings and kept your birthday card under the seat of his truck, and that is more than most people get. I think about that conference table a lot. Not with bitterness, more like the way you think about a fork in the road you can now see clearly from a distance. On one side, the house, the accounts, the car, a settlement that would have looked on paper like I'd won something. On the other side, an old man with a slight droop on the left side of his mouth and a toolbox wrapped in moving blankets. I chose the toolbox, and I want to be honest about what that choice actually required, because I don't think it was just kindness. Kindness alone doesn't get you through 6 weeks of legal negotiations while sleeping next to someone you've already decided to leave. What got me through was something harder and quieter than kindness. It was clarity, the ability to look at my own life without flinching and ask, what is actually real here? What have I been building toward, and what have I been building with? When I stripped away everything Drew had told me our life was, what remained that was genuinely mine? Frank remained. That was it. That was the whole inventory. People make the mistake of thinking that walking away from money is noble. It isn't necessarily. Sometimes it's just accurate, an honest accounting of what something was actually worth. The house wasn't worth what it would have cost me to stay in it. The accounts weren't worth the feeling of having let myself be written off in exchange for a check. I didn't leave Drew's assets behind because I was above them. I left them behind because I understood, finally, what I actually valued, and those things weren't on his list. That's the part no one tells you about going through something like this, the way it forces you to get smart about yourself. Not book smart. Not the kind of intelligence I'd been chasing in law school, though that mattered too. I mean the kind of knowing that comes from sitting in a parking lot at 10 o'clock at night with a credit card statement and deciding you're going to look at it directly instead of away. The kind that makes you call Diane before you confront your husband, because you understand that the most important thing isn't your anger. It's your next move. I had to become a clearer thinker than I'd ever been in the middle of the worst year of my life, and I'm grateful for that, even though I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And then there was Frank, watching him in that first neurologist's appointment, listening carefully, asking good questions, taking notes in the small spiral notebook he'd brought. I thought about what it takes to face something like that with that kind of steadiness. He never catastrophized. He never felt sorry for himself in a way that paralyzed him. He just went to therapy on Tuesdays and made friends with Ray and kept showing up. That's not a small thing. That's a life philosophy that doesn't have a name, but deserves one. I pass it on to my clients now, the ones who sit across from me in the worst moments of their own lives. I tell them the outcome of this will be shaped not by what was done to you, but by how clearly you can see and how long you can hold on. Those two things, clear sight and the will to keep going, are the only things no one can take in a settlement. Frank taught me that. He taught me by just being himself, consistently, for years, without ever knowing he was teaching anything at all. That's the whole lesson. That's all of it.